Hey folks, James Newman, DVRT Master Instructor and owner of Quest Fitness here in Guilford, Connecticut. I want to talk to you real quickly about progressing your training with the Ultimate Sandbag into that transverse plane. Or how do I start to train for myself and for my clients in rotation? Well, we need to be careful, right? Because for a lot of people, especially our clients, Ultimate Sandbag training in DVRT is their first time they're truly exposed to multi-planar training. And that's very complex. Now, I'm not talking about planar dominant, not just changing the plane I'm moving in, but I'm talking about moving in one plane, stabilizing in another, and having our USB move in a third, all at the same time. That's super complex, it's dynamic, and it's what rotational training is all about, right? That's that high level of multiplanar training, right? It's really why DVRT was designed, right? Give us the ability to train with power, force, and efficiency and safety in all three planes of motion at once in 360 degrees, right? The way it happens in sport and in life. Now, we need to, number one, be able to resist in that transverse plane before we can actually start to move or produce force in that plane, right? So once we've established a good baseline of control in the frontal plane, we can start to introduce a little bit of rotational force, right? And see how we resist it. Anti-rotational force. So the easiest way to do this is take one of our big 6 exercises, and that's shouldering, right? By crossing the midline of the body in this clean movement, we are actually creating an anti-rotational force. I'm going to be checking how well do I absorb that force as it's coming up. I'll hinge back at the hips, get a good grip of the bag, shoulders packed, and I'll get that bag up to my shoulder. Like I said, I crossed the midline, so just even receiving that bag has forced me to resist that rotation. From here, I've got a little bit of frontal flexion, frontal plane flexion, lateral flexion that I'm resisting as well. But because I have the bag at an asymmetrical load, I'm also resisting rotation, even just standing here. So I'm challenging my body to not only stand in the sagittal plane, I'm resisting that frontal plane and also resisting that transverse plane as well. It's a great starting point. From here, I can start to add movement, right? I can start to squat, straight down, straight up, right? Now I can layer on just a little bit more complexity by turning this into a staggered stance. Now, like Steve showed us in the previous video, I'm introducing a little bit more frontal plane stability. I've layered on another level of complexity for my body to deal with. I'm resisting force in that frontal plane, a little bit more so I'm watching my hips, and I'm also resisting that rotational movement as well at the same time. Now, if I show mastery and control there, I can start to layer a little bit more explosive movements. I can start to deal with deceleration by adding a lunge pattern, right? I can go forward, I can go backward in the sagittal plane. I can even start to add frontal plane movement, okay? So as I go through those planes of motion and add another layer of complexity, I'm challenging my body even more to resist that rotation, right? I can make it even more difficult by adding movement to the bag in another plane of motion. Down. So now that rotational force is shifting across my body as I get even more frontal plane challenge by arc pressing the bag while I do that reverse lunge arc press thruster, okay? So these are just layers that we can use to help us build proficiency and control in that transverse plane before we actually start to rotate. Now, when it's time to rotate, now we have to start thinking again as progressive. So if I'm going to start to move the bag in another plane of motion, right? I'm going to bring it to a very stable position. So I'm going to do the same reverse lunge I just did with the bag in that front-loaded position instead of the shoulder. So this is a much more stable position as I introduce another layer of complexity, right? Another plane of motion that I'm going to have to deal with. So as I go into that reverse lunge, I'll slowly rotate the bag just a little bit and come on back up, right? So now I'm dealing not only with that, I'm moving the sagittal plane, dealing with the frontal plane stress of lunging, right, absorbing force, but I'm also starting to move the bag in that transverse plane. Very subtle and small at first, but it can get bigger. The dimension of the bag will start to challenge you in different ways to start to layer intensity and complexity into that movement, all the while challenging all those 3 planes of motion at once, right? That's gonna lead us to moving into the max lunge. Now, I'll bring the bag down into a position where it's not quite as stable, where it can float a little bit more. I'm not holding as tight to it. So now as I go into that reverse lunge, the bag's gonna move to one side, right? And slowly at first, I'm going to go just one side, checking for myself and for my clients that I'm able to stabilize, keep myself moving in one direction while the bag moves through the third. Again, we're moving through all 3 planes of motion at once. Once I've established, I can go slow, side to side. I can start to go alternating feet, dealing with crossing that midline, back and forth. And from here, I can start to produce force and power, placing more demand on my body to stabilize in that transverse plane. These are all just steps we could take. Luckily, all the moves you do with DVRT training are leading you in that direction. Rotational training is really the end game for working with the Ultimate Sandbag and the DVRT system. Again, learning how to move in that 360 degrees, all those planes of motion all at once, that's how life and sport happens. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Love to hear them. Hope to see you soon. Take care.